Welcome to Leadership Bites with myself, your host, Guy Bloom. This is a leadership podcast where I have conversations with colleagues, I chat with guests, and sometimes there'll be just me talking. You can connect with me at livingbrave.com, and when you enjoy the episode, subscribe and please tell everyone. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing, Guy?
I'm doing well, and I know that we have a topic which we'll launch straight into, so I'm going to get you to do this is why it took my interest, and then we'll see where the conversation takes us.
Sure, absolutely. I thought that we should talk about the NHS. I'm very, very bothered about it. You know, the NHS has been around longer than we've been around. And it came in at a time after the Second World War when people, if they got ill, they must have been terrified of getting ill because they couldn't afford diagnosis, let alone treatment or medication or whatever it might be. People were dying in pain. It was a real horror show when the NHS came in. And the NHS came in a blaze of idealism. The whole idea was if we can spend money on looking after the nation, then the nation will get healthier, and however much we have to spend at the start doesn't matter, because eventually, you know, the amount of money will come down because the nation will be less sick and so on. And exactly the reverse has happened. What's happened is when the NHS came in the late 40s, we spent about 4% of GDP on it. And now we're spending around 10 plus percent of GDP on it. So I'm not talking about the amount of money, I'm talking about the proportion of GDP that we spend on looking after the nation's health. And the problem with that rising inexorably is that we either can't afford it now, or there'll become a point where we can't. And yet the track record of the NHS lately has been very poor. You know, we've got 7 million people waiting for treatment. We've got doctors and nurses collapsing because of the amount of stress and strain on them. We've got nurses on the streets saying, you're not paying us enough. You were happy to applaud us during the pandemic, but now the government won't even pay us an inflation-based pay rise. So we've got signs of stress and strain all over the place. And I'm bothered because someone once said that the NHS is the closest that the Brits have to a national religion. In other words, we love it, but at the moment, it's a love-hate relationship. And if you talk to people about the NHS, if it ever comes up over a dinner or a drink in the pub, you find people weighing in to the issue about ain't it awful? Excuse me. Happened to me just the other day. Someone said, I can't get through to my GP practice. They clearly don't care. You get there and you find there's an empty waiting room. So what the dickens are they doing with their time? And there's absolutely no understanding of the stress that the doctors are under themselves, and that the fact that they've got empty waiting rooms is because they're trying to practice infection control at a time when the bugs are still around. The pandemic is still with us. And so all sorts of misunderstandings are going on at the same time. So the thing that's triggered my concern is that the NHS, on the one hand, we love it. Certainly we need it. But at the moment, we're not paying enough as a nation to look after it and to look after the people who work in it. And yet it's consuming greater proportions of GDP.
So I recognise that I have a layman's understanding of the NHS, and I also know that you know a lot about it. So I'm super alert to that. I guess when I look from the outside in, I've used the NHS a few times, and the big one was when my little boy had an asthma attack, and this ambulance turned up about 10 minutes later, put everything right. We took him to the Birmingham's Children's Hospital, which is technically down the road from us, and they took him straight to the front of the queue because of just age and symptoms, and it was all fantastic, and he's all well and good. You only have to need it to go, what the hell would you do if it wasn't there? You made a phone call, the lady answered the phone, I was and ahhing, she said, I can hear his breathing, I'm sending an ambulance. And you go, right. So it's like all things, you know, people say, well, I don't believe in God, and I go, well, unless somebody's shooting at you, and then you go, dear God, if you get me out of this, right, I'll be a believer. And what I'm trying to get at is you don't think about these things maybe until the moment. And when I look at it from the outside in, I see anything from, in the news, drugs that people create that cost an exorbitant amount of money, and you get a sense of profiteering. You get a sense of wasted money on things that have been invested in and haven't happened. Diversity czars, things that make you go,
You know, there are all sorts of reasons why costs why medical inflation outstrips the growth of GDP. One of them is we have an aging population. The demography of our country is particularly problematical. We've got the baby boomers, I'm one of them, coming through, and they are now inflating the higher age echelons. The older population is getting bigger, and the productive younger population, which is meant to support that old aging population, is getting smaller, relatively speaking. And so demography is one reason. Research is another one, exactly as you're saying. We can now treat more and more things, but often with more and more esoteric, and that equals expensive medication. And even if you strip away all the profiteering, because you're dealing with more rare and unusual conditions, drug companies can't amortize their research over so many prescriptions per year or per month. So what they have to do is charge rather more to get back the investment that they made in the research in the first place. You've also got a third factor, which is incredible, which is that most people have an expectation now that all ills can or should be cured, and that if not, then someone's screwing up. Why can't they deal with it? And that tends to bring with it a kind of over-medicalisation of everyday issues. So the other day, I read an article about someone who's trying to think about prescribing for loneliness. Well, that seems to me to be bonkers, that you've got to, if someone's lonely, what they need is contact, not medication. And so there's all sorts of fundamental reasons why medical inflation increases at a faster rate than the growth of GDP. But even though I can explain that, we have to realise that there is an intrinsic danger in that, and that is that at some point we've got to say enough. We can't afford to do that anymore. And it seems to me that there's this, what I've called a kind of triplet at the heart of it all. What we want is three things, and any two of them you can have, but you add the third and it's a problem. One is we want access. We want to be able to get to our healthcare provider quickly and easily when we need him or her. Secondly, quality. We want to make sure that the care we get is of the highest professional standards, not just in absolute terms, but also relative to other prosperous countries. We don't want to settle for second best. The third is, so we've got access, you've got quality, but you've also got affordability. We want as a nation not to bankrupt ourselves paying for all this. And you can have any two very easily, but the moment you add the third one, you've got a problem. In the old days, what used to happen was we'd get high quality care and it was reasonably affordable, but we let waiting lists increase, so access dropped, in order to be the balancing mechanism in that little trio of issues. Now, long waiting lists are unacceptable, even though we've got 7 million people waiting for treatment. But waiting in A&E, waiting for treatment, all of these things, we've got rules and targets that are imposed in the context of, and so we can't have that balancing mechanism anymore. Now, I'm not arguing for waiting; that's not a good thing at all. But other countries don't seem to have this as a problem. I was talking to a practitioner from Belgium the other day who said, if tomorrow you wanted to get your hip done, you could get it. You just go and you pitch up and someone will do it for you. For some reason, their blend of public and private funding seems to have solved a problem which we in the UK haven't solved. And I think it may be that the other way of putting it is this: people want everything dealt with for everyone and free. Well, again, you can have any two, but not the third one. And maybe we've got to think quite hard, fundamentally and maybe firstly, about what's called the funding model. Is it sensible to try and do all this through taxation?
At its most simplistic, is this we're either in or we're out? If we're all in, to what level, to what end, the bottomless pit? Or are we, no, we're in, we're committed to an NHS. I suppose, is it the problem that cannot be sorted, because you have politics, you have people on 3-year terms, you have people that are embedded in for life in roles that probably are quite difficult to get dismissed from unless you do something fundamentally criminal. And just like any big beast, and it is a big beast, there'll be excellence in there. There'll be dedicated, high-level people who just give their lives to it. And then guess what? There'll be those that probably shouldn't be enrolled. But that's the same in any organisation. It's just that with a big beast like that,
1.2 million people work for the NHS, so
exactly.
There's a fair chance that there'll be some of each.
So there's a distribution curve, right? And I just wonder, when you're talking to people that really know about these things, does anybody have what they would say is the answer?
No. At the moment, there are a number of initiatives that are trying to address it. The Times, I don't know if you've noticed, there's the Times have created the Times Health and Social Care Commission. It is a grouping of about, I'm guessing, about 20 people sit on the Times Health Commission. They've got the great and the good. They've got Lord this and Lord that, and they've got, people who run major institutions, major organisations and so on. And they're receiving evidence every, I think it's 2 weeks, from experts in the field, and they're going to report on the future of the NHS and social care in early 2024. They're meeting throughout this year, 2023, to try and come to some sensible conclusions about that. The answers, the reason they're throwing so much effort at it, and presumably quite a lot of money at it as well, is because the answers are not obvious and they're not easy. If they were, we'd have done it by now. The second is people like the Institute for Public Policy Research, who are, if anything, a slightly sort of leftward-leaning think tank, and they've got an investigation, a commission going on at the moment, in which they're looking at the relationship between fairness in our society, health in our society, and prosperity. Their argument is a fairer society is a healthier society, is a more prosperous society. And so they're examining a variety of issues to do with that. So a number of people are directing their attention at the moment at these issues. And even I and my colleagues at Henley Business School, along with David Haslam, who wrote the book Side Effects, we're going to be having a symposium in June about all of this. The point is, Guy, that it's a very, very complex issue. And you touched on something which really matters here, and that is that governments of both right and left are not in the best position to initiate change in this area, because it will take much longer than usually a political horizon extends to. What does a government think about? They think about 5 years. Why? Because that's roughly the term of a parliament. And so, but my guess is that to change the NHS and the way we use it fundamentally, it would take a generation, I suspect. And we've got to think much longer term and much more ambitiously. But one of the things I do believe very firmly is that we aren't going to get there by doing the kind of muddling through and tinkering that seem to be characteristic of most governments at the moment. I also got a slight suspicion that the Tories can't fix it because they won't be trusted. Labour might have a chance to do it if they come in next time around. And that's only because not only did they create the NHS in the Labour Party, but maybe they'll be trusted that if they're taking tough decisions, it might be because they believe in the greater good for the greater number of people. Whereas I think that, although it might be a stereotype, I think an awful lot of the reactions to a Conservative government is that they are more likely to want to serve the interests of a small number of wealthier people.
So does that put us in a place where there'll be lots of educated people or people with an interest having fantastic conversations? Reality is we have a political system that means unless there's a bipartisan agreement that regardless of political views, we are going to work on this, because whatever the rotations, one of us is going to keep on ending up with the NHS. So actually, you know what, let's agree to fix it regardless of anything else. If that doesn't happen, it's a potato that keeps getting passed.
I think that's right. I think that the governments of right and left have tended to kick the can down the road. You know, they've come up with short-term, temporary, pressure-relieving sums of money every few years in order to sort of bypass, or if you like, relieve the pressure for fundamental change. I think the problem is that if a right-wing government raises the issue about we need to change the NHS fundamentally, I suspect they'll lose the next election. If a left-wing government says it, the charge is always, here we go, tax and spend again. And of course, right now, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are trying to portray a much more responsible fiscal image, that they're not going to be a government that simply spends money right, left and centre, and simply increases national borrowing. So I think that each party is to some extent hamstrung by the impressions that we all have. And my own view, therefore, is that I think that we've got somehow to get the nation involved in debating this. When we do our conversations through these podcasts, Guy, we sometimes wonder kind of what's the punchline. Well, I think that for me, the punchline about the NHS is we've all got to talk about it a lot right now, and not just in ain't it awful terms. We've got to think about, so what would be a better solution for all of us? And partly it's going to be implications for us all. Maybe we don't use the NHS very well. Maybe we have unrealistic expectations of it. My daughter, who's a GP, and my son-in-law, her husband, who is an A&E consultant, they will tell you that for all the people waiting in accident and emergency, there are an awful lot of people who haven't had an accident and it isn't an emergency. So why are they there? And they're there because they believe that, they can't get through to their GP, so someone's got to deal with this, so they're going to damn well get the care that they think they want or need or deserve one way or another. And maybe we've got to sort of try and exercise a little more discipline. Maybe we've got to go upstream. We've got to practice prevention more. We've got to sort of put a little more weight on each other to lose weight, eat more healthily, do all of these things that actually means that we don't just emphasise our rights to care, but also our responsibilities to look after the system and so on. But the nation needs to debate this. Governments can't sort this for us.
So you alluded to countries that have, there's probably no version of perfection, but seem to have it more right than wrong. Is it historical? Is it no? It's because recently what they did was? What is it that gives them that more right than wrong?
Well, this is an interesting one. The moment you get into international comparisons, you realise quite quickly that you're not comparing like with like. As I said, we've got a particular problem in the UK of an ageing population. Now, everyone's got an ageing population, and particularly because of the baby boomers, they're kind of it's an OECD-wide problem. But we have a particularly strong version of that. So we wouldn't be comparing quite like with like. But here are two statistics which I think are worth conjuring with. One is we spend roughly the OECD average as a proportion of GDP on healthcare. We spend about 10.2%, and the OECD average is about 10.2%. So we spend roughly the average of.
Can you just say what those things stand for people?
Gross domestic product. So the UK. The gross domestic product, let's say, is roughly 2 trillion a year or something. In the UK, we spend about 10.2% of that on health and social care, and that is the OECD average. The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's the organisation of, in a sense, the richest countries in the world, and we're one of them. And so we spend roughly the same proportion of our national wealth on health and social care as the OECD average. But that still doesn't mean that we get the same amount available per person, because another estimate that Fergus Walsh gave, and I've checked it out, he gave it on the BBC just recently, we spend, if you compare the amount of money that we spend per person on healthcare in the UK, it's roughly 18% less than the OECD average, or if you like, the average of amongst what are called the old European economies, which are reasonable comparisons for us, like Germany and Italy and France and Spain and so on, Belgium.
And that's going into administration or salaries, or where's that going?
It's going. it's going into lots of places, but it's partly to do simply with the numbers of the amount of provision per head of population. So although we can spend overall a similar proportion of GDP, it may be that because of the size and shape of our distribution, it doesn't translate into the amount to be spent per person. Yeah. So imagine 18%. We spent, I think it's 168 billion on the NHS last year. 168 billion. And we're 18% less per person. Imagine so a government comes in and says, we're going to fix this. We need 18% more. So, 18% of 168 billion is an awful lot of billions of pounds. And if all that goes on taxation, people are going to throw their hands up in horror, particularly when there's such a big cost of living crisis. But we've got to do something radical. We've got to get away from some of the old sacred cows that have stopped us introducing radical change so far. Like, for example, it costs roughly £40 per GP consultation that the NHS has to pay. £40. Well, I could afford to pay that, so could you. 40 quid. So why don't they ask us to pay for it? Well,
I would pay that.
Yeah, I would too. But okay, but then what happens is, you mention that, and an awful lot of very well informed, very well intentioned people, and I can tell you a whole bunch of them. For example, I've sat on the trustee board of the Royal College of General Practitioners, and the GPs themselves are massively against it because they say it punishes all the people who've got the greatest health problems. Okay, so I get that. But what about charging people at least for the consultations that they don't turn up for, that they miss? Oh, that also punishes all the wrong people, they say.
It's means tested, and you don't get to the front of the list by paying. It's just that when you do get the appointment, you can pay.
Yeah, I think we've got to start considering. We've got to shoot a few sacred cows, I think, and a mixed funding model has got to be one of them. This notion that it all has to be free at the point of use may be the thing that needs to go first. There'll be other things as well, but that needs maybe to go first. And I've come reluctantly to that conclusion personally, that we've got to probably pay disproportionate amounts per unit of care, because and probably on a as you said, means tested basis. And the simple way of doing that presumably is through taxation. That if you've got higher rate taxpayers, why wouldn't they pay per consultation, or pay more per consultation than people who pay basic rate or no tax at all? So it does feel to me as if there are some mechanisms that we could start to introduce if we'd once allow ourselves the freedom to consider these more radical solutions.
So this is one of those moments where one of the things we started to say is we're going to talk about topics that kind of make us go, without necessarily having the answer. And there's definitely no answer to the NHS.
There isn't a single answer. I think my sense, Guy, is that we've got to get this debate going nationally. If there's anything I would like to initiate right now, it's a national debate about these things. We've got to get ordinary people, you and me, talking about it, not politicians, not just senior doctors. Of course, they need to be a part of the conversation and so on. But the National Health Service belongs to all of us. It serves all of us. It's the most precious thing in the world.
Could it get privatised? Could that be a thing where it just?
I'm not sure what you gain.
No, I don't mean gain, but is there a threat to it being just literally privatised? Yeah,
I think there is. I think the more people experience frustration with it, the more there's a tendency to throw our hands up and do something that might be precipitate. And always the fear is that governments of the right wing want to privatise it. I'm not sure they do, but it's always the great fear. I suppose it's possible that a government could decide to do that, but I think that they would have to they'd have to consider the very real possibility that the moment they mention it, they lose their next election.
Yes, just because of people's reaction to their love for it or belief or need in it. And this is, I guess, and I'll just throw this little hand grenade into the conversation. I speak to people as well, and some people will go, so why are we in the Ukraine then and not spending that on the NHS? People look at things that we do that might go, ideologically, I can see why we might want to be in there. You could agree or disagree with that. But when I hear how much a tank costs, when I hear how much every one of those missiles costs, what is the actual sum that has gone into funding that intervention? Which meant we were willing to spend it. Which means the money could be found, which means why wasn't it already found, put into something of that high value? Of course, I have no answer to that. Those are the kind of rhetorics that I think people can get quite frustrated about, which is about, and maybe you're getting people to talk about it, is it's got to be, if we can make it so high on the agenda that the politicians know that it has to be addressed to win the battle, so to speak, for them. Because at the moment it seems to be, well, we've got the Ukraine, we've got education, there's such a smorgasbord of things to deal with. It's just another one of those big problems, so we just divvy up all the money. But
do you know
maybe if we can push it to the front of the conversation, it's got to be dealt with.
Do you know that we spend more on the NHS than we spend on education and defence combined?
I can believe that.
So, and the other thing is that liberating short-term funds isn't the solution. That's the kicking the can down the road. We've got to do a root and branch rethink. It's got to become sustainable. What we don't want is, this silly former Brexit argument about 350 million a day or, per nanosecond or whatever it was. We could spend that on the NHS. Well, we've got Brexit. We didn't spend it on the NHS. Fair enough. But the point is that it's a fundamental rethink of how this whole system works that we need to get the people debating. What would you be? In other words, if I could create a conversation for every single man and woman in the country to have, it would start with, if I could promise you an absolutely first class healthcare system that you could get access to quickly and easily, what would you be prepared to pay for that? What would you be prepared to sacrifice or contribute to pay for that?
This is a podcast called Leadership Bites. Why we're talking about the NHS? Well, I think it leads us into little topics like when you're running organisations, you can't kick things down the road because eventually it's going to bite you in the arse.
Well, we were chatting before we started to record about big beasts who come in and make radical changes to their organisation. We talked about Elon Musk laying off a whole stack of people at Twitter and so on. Because when you come in from the outside, you think, what the dickens are we doing spending all this money on the X, Y or Z? And it seems to me that you can do that in an organisation because you understand that most organisations have lost sight some time ago of the fundamental core purpose of their organisation. And they've got an awful lot of people who are not contributing to that core purpose. Now, it's an old example, but I used to do consultancy years ago for what used to be called London Weekend Television. And I remember talking to some of the programme makers, and they said that for every programme maker that they hire here, they hire 10 people to stop them. And that's what they thought of the admin, the legal department, etc., etc. But that was the kind of belief and this idea of coming back to the absolutely fundamental purpose. But I'll tell you what's interesting about Sir David Haslam's book Side Effects is it raises this horrifying question. What is the purpose of the NHS? It can't be to treat everyone for everything free, can it? That can't be the fundamental purpose because that's not sustainable right from the start. So what is that fundamental purpose? And when at Henley Business School, when we debate this in June, that's the question we're going to debate. What do we want the NHS to do for us?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because you could say, well, we'd like accident and emergency, maybe more discipline around filtering out, I'm having a heart attack, I'd like an ambulance please, that kind of level. Yeah, maybe there is a core, if you've got heart problems, if you've got kidney failure, and I don't know where the list stops, but maybe the tier 1, and we're going to give you those for free. And then there's a cost for tier 2, and there's a cost for tier 3.
Exactly so.
And that's maybe the big debate, right? We can't be everything free forever for everybody.
Yes, exactly. So let's just think about those three things. We deal with everything. Well, maybe we don't. Maybe the NHS, as you said, is for a certain number of core problems, conditions, issues, whatever. And anything else, there's an increasing level of charge for. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or what about the other? We deal with everything, but not for everyone. So maybe there are certain people who get covered by the NHS. Maybe the NHS becomes a system for people who are relatively impecunious. They haven't got an awful lot of funds. And maybe what it is a kind of a safety net, and that everyone else pays for their care.
But what we are saying is that just like any commercial enterprise, there needs to be a recognition that, number one, we can't kick the can down the road. Number two, we might be on a 3, 4, 5-year career cycle. But the reality is, if we actually care about this organisation, then we need to take a longer-term view as well as a short-term view. There might be also something here about the willingness to make radical decisions. You know, sometimes when you see a car that's had its shape redesigned, you go, oh, that's awful. And 3 months later, you're used to it. And you go, actually, that's quite good. Apple got rid of the disk drive, and we all thought, well, how does the computer work then? It takes that radical kind of, there might be a bit of pain, but we have thought this through, to actually go, the sign of madness is repeating the same pattern and expecting something different to change. So we've got to do something. And it is a social experiment to a point, but it probably can't go that wrong. So we're going to go for it.
There is an upside. I mean, firstly, the folks who work in the NHS, they're bloody wonderful. I tell you, I know I'm slightly biased because I've got a couple of my family members who do, but you know,
the vast majority,
large, they're fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, no wonder we applauded them. You know, they put their own lives on the line for the rest of us. You know, that's about, what is it? A greater love hath no man than this, that a man lays down his life for his friends. I mean, I say it in a sexist way because it was written in a sexist way, but you know, but that's true. And they did that. They did that willingly. You know, no one made them do that. I absolutely fundamentally believe in the motivation of NHS people. So I think that that's something that is a cause for optimism. But we can't keep trading on that. My daughter, bless her heart, GP, was having not an argument, but a discussion certainly with a practice manager the other day. You know, and she said, look, the system's broken. Why are they breaking us to fix it? Because, you know, you've got to do more, you've got to do more, you've got to do more. Incidentally, the evidence is that in general practice, fewer people are treating more patients. In secondary hospital care, more people are treating fewer patients. That's the way it is at the moment.
And when I go into organisations, it's broken, so why are they breaking us to make it work? It's not an unfamiliar story, right?
No, that's right.
And that does exist. So just my recognition there is this needs to become a conversation that maybe is picked up by people, and we make it something that actually rings loud enough that the bell is heard.
I think that's right. I mean, my sense is that always the fear is that you're crying wolf. I now think, actually, that the risk of the demise of the NHS is simply a statement of the blindingly obvious. It's no longer crying wolf. It is a very, very real risk. And it's too precious. As a nation, we've got to look after it, and we've got to do it in the most deliberate and participative way. We've got to get more and more people. There's an organisation I came across recently called Engage Britain. They were presenting at this Institute for Public Policy Research Symposium just in December, just last month. What they do is they run focus groups around the country, discussion groups around the country, to ask people what they want of their government in order to try and facilitate what they call bottom-up policy making. I really applaud that idea. That seems to me to be really sensible. After all, we are a democracy in which the government is meant to serve the population, serve the electorate. But there isn't always a simple way of making sure that happens, whereas organisations, I think, like Engage Britain, have a way of starting to do that, starting to convene the groups that have these discussions. I applaud them. I'd love to take part. I haven't. I'll try to make contact with them fairly soon. But I'm very, very, very keen that more and more of us should make our voices heard around this stuff. As I say, I don't want to bang on about it endlessly. I could bore for Britain on the subject and probably have one already. But I think we've all got to get involved in this one, mate.
Well, I think just bringing it to an end, you'll care about it if it's not there, right? And you'll care about it if it's not working to the point where it's absolutely broken. So I think hard to have an opinion if you've taken no care to engage.
Yeah.
I have an opinion. What have you done about it? Absolutely nothing. Well, hey ho, that's definitely a factor. On that note, I'll bring us to a close. We will pick up again as we see new topics that pique our interest. But once again, I'll sign off and see and speak to you soon.
Take care, guy. Cheers.
That's it. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please share so others get to hear about us, and subscribe so you keep up to date on new episodes. Also visit livingbrave.com if you want to connect with me and find out more about executive coaching, team effectiveness and changing culture. Oh, and of course you can buy my book Living Brave Leadership on Amazon. So on that note, see you soon.